the basics of strategic workforce planning. Strategic workforce planning is a practical and strategy-driven example of HR analytics. Strategic workforce planning essentially looks at what's the organizational strategy, where do we want to go as an organization, and what workforce capabilities do we actually have in the organization. And if there's a gap between where you want to go and what you have, you need to strategically plan your workforce, aka strategic workforce planning. And because strategic workforce planning is such a practical example of HR analytics, and secondly because it's very strategy driven, which is something that people who start in HR analytics often forget, we'll start this course with strategic workforce planning. And remember, everything we say about strategic workforce planning applies one-on-one to HR analytics, because strategic workforce planning is a way of doing HR analytics. Why is strategic workforce planning so important? Well, first of all, the world is changing faster and faster, and this is only increasing. There's not a local marketplace anymore, there's a global marketplace, and this means that there's increased global competition. Innovation and organizational change has therefore become a constant process. You need to stay on top of your game, otherwise you'll disappear. And your product to market speed is starting to become a critically important element in building a competitive edge. Why? Because it's really easy to reach your customers through, for example, the internet. So being the first to launch your product has traditionally never been seen as a competitive edge, because you have the follower advantage, you have the advantage of learning from the leader. But increasingly, with good distribution using the internet, this advantage of being the first to market starts to become more and more important. So your product to market speed is a critical component in building a competitive edge. These reasons taken together means that human capital has become a really important factor in the production of goods and services. Additionally, because a lot of the less critical human capital elements, working at a production line for example, has become automated. So the human capital that survives, that remains, is more and more critical compared to the average human capital that an organization had 20 or 30 years ago. So the hard to replace jobs remain, and these are the jobs that need to be done very well. And there's famous research about the difference between high performers and normal performers, and this difference is 10x. So a superb writer is 10 times better than an average writer in terms of performance, in terms of money coming in. And the same holds true for programmers. A really good programmer makes less mistakes, so people need less time to fix it. There's less bugs in it. The programmer is able to program better, to program smarter, to write less numbers of lines of code for the same thing, so it's processed quicker, it's more efficient, etc. And you see this coming back in lawyers, in bankers, in, as I said, writers, in creatives. You see this effect taking place in all kinds of different functions. So finding the high performers is really important, because they are exponentially better compared to the normal performers. Well, this increased competition calls for a cost efficiency. Having superior performers will mean a way more cost-efficient way of running your business. So to summarize, high performers perform exponentially better compared to normal performers because of the increase in competition, a better fit between what the organization needs and what the workforce provides, and that's when we talk about workforce planning, is starting to become more and more important. The big question is, what is strategic workforce planning? Strategic workforce planning is a strategic design process that ensures continuity of the business by identifying and securing critical roles and determining and reducing the skills gap in the workforce. So first of all, it's a strategic design process. A strategic design process is a process in which aspects of the workforce, which are misaligned with the organizational strategy, are identified, analyzed, this is where HR analytics comes in, and realigned to fit the current business goals. It's in the name. A strategic design process is connected to the organizational strategy. The second part of the definition is about identifying and securing critical roles. That's what we just talked about, the high performers who are exponentially better compared to the average performers. And determining and reducing the skills gap in the workforce. So why do organizations start with strategic workforce planning? A big part is a demographical change that you see happening everywhere in the Western world, which is an aging workforce. People are becoming older and older, and at some point they stop working. So a lot of organizations are facing a daunting exodus of an aging workforce, all kinds of baby boomers walking out of the door. And that's threatening. That's threatening the continuity of the business, that threatens the viability of the business. An older workforce is also more expensive because younger people, I'm not going to say they perform better, but they are at least cheaper, so they perform more efficiently. They use less resources, they burn less money for the organization, and their performance is on the same level. Being able to change your workforce into a younger workforce means a more competitive workforce. We already discussed the demand and importance of strategic talent management, which organizations are really starting to see now. And the market is changing more and more rapidly, so organizations do see that they need to adapt to that market, and they are starting to take measures. And strategic workforce planning is one of the measures that organizations take in order to stay more competitive and to, as an organization, be flexible and change alongside with the marketplace. Now, as an HR analyst, you need to know what to focus on when analyzing your workforce. And this model is really helpful in this process. In this picture, you see 4 key workforce characteristics. You see the size, the shape, the cost, and the agility. When you start to do an analytics project, you need to keep these 4 elements in mind. In the next few years, a lot of baby boomers will start getting out of the workforce and leaving your company. So that will impact your size. That will impact the number of vacancies within your organization. And size, of course, also has to do with overstaffing. If you have too much personnel and not enough work, you're overstaffed, so you're lacking the right size. So size is really related to cost that we'll talk about later. Second, you need to have the right shape in your workforce. And shape has everything to do with having the critical competencies within your organization. And that means the critical competencies for today. So which competencies do I need to have to serve my clients well? But also which competencies do I need to develop towards the future in order to stay competitive, in order to serve my future clients' needs, etc. So when you talk about shape, you talk about, for example, a skills gap in developers. A lot of companies are really looking for developers and they just can't find the right personnel to do their job. So that has everything to do with shape. And it also has to do with filling the right positions at the top of your company. So succession management. That has to do with the shape of your workforce. So in order to get the right shape, you need to identify the critical competencies the workforce needs today and in a number of years, so in the future. And you need to be sure that you get them in and that you have the right people on the right critical functions. The third element is cost. Your workforce needs to be cost efficient and manageable in terms of cost. And when we talk about the aging workforce, you see that costs are becoming increasingly harder to manage. And the fourth element is right agility. Your workforce needs to be agile, resilient, and flexible. And the right level of agility will change per organization. Some organizations are highly competitive. They need to change with a very rapidly changing marketplace. But you also see more traditional companies that are doing what they're doing for a long time already, and they're still doing it the right way. They don't need to be as agile as the previous companies I mentioned. So having the right size, the right shape, the right cost, and the right agility is really very important. And when you're doing an analysis, keep these 4 key workforce characteristics in mind. Think, hey, am I looking at size now, at shape, at cost and at agility. And when I give an analytics advice or a workforce planning advice to a senior manager, for example, have I calculated the cost? And have I thought about the agility? How this will impact my workforce? Keep these 4 key workforce characteristics in mind. And what I would advise you is pause the video and write those 4 down and try to apply them to a key business problem within your organization. So when you talk about the aging workforce, think, hey, size will start to fluctuate because people are getting older, absence behavior is increasing, and after a number of years, people will leave the company. So the size will really differ, which means that we'll lose a number of critical competencies. Which competencies do we need in the future in order to stay successful? And which younger people, younger employees can we then attract and hire in order to keep the right shape of the workforce today, but also towards the future? How will this impact my costs? As I said, an older workforce means less cost efficiency, so a higher level of cost. And the agility, especially for an older workforce, is also hard because with age it becomes harder to change current practices. So an aging workforce impacts all 4 elements. And depending on the issues that your company is dealing with, these 4 elements will give you some insights in the things you need to focus on when you start to analyze these key subjects using HR analytics. So pause the video and do this short exercise. When you look at strategic workforce planning, you can differentiate between 4 different levels. The first, or the bottom level, is traditional workforce planning. That's the kind of workforce planning that we know for a long time already. It's about analyzing internal supply and demand. Do we need new people? Are people leaving? Okay, there's a discrepancy between supply and demand. And let's make sure that we have the right people at the right place at the right time. So it's about hiring, firing, promoting, and just having the internal workforce operational. And oftentimes this is done using simple human resource information systems. So you look in your system, you see what's happening, and you adapt as an organization. A more advanced level is HR dashboarding. When you create an HR dashboard, you need to aggregate different data sources and combine them and visualize them in a dashboard. And when I say aggregating different data sources, I mean, for example, your applicant tracking system with your performance management system and your normal human resource information system. When you combine that kind of data, you can see, for example, hey, how did this person perform on his entry assessment when he started working for a company? And how is this person 2 years later performing? What kind of performance rating does this person get? And that helps you to build a profile about your ideal candidate to hire. That's just one example of how you can engage in HR analytics by combining different data sources. HR dashboarding is a more advanced level of strategic workforce planning, as it helps you to show what capabilities you have in your current organization and how can you leverage that to comply with the future strategy. Now, a more advanced level of strategic workforce planning is scenario planning. And in scenario planning, you start to create different scenarios to help evaluate strategic analyses. And if you use your HR analytics capabilities really well, you can do these scenario analyses in an almost automated way, where you say, hey, if these things change, then my workforce will change like this. But that's a very advanced level of analytics. Now, the most advanced level of strategic workforce planning is basically strategic workforce planning as it is in the name, which means the use of traditional workforce planning, HR dashboarding, scenario planning, and all the other tools you have at your disposal to translate strategical outcomes in tactical and operational mid to long-term plans. So, the purpose of strategic workforce planning, as we saw previously, is about aligning the workforce with the organizational strategy through using the techniques of HR analytics, the traditional techniques of workforce planning, and scenario planning in order to reduce the skills gap in your workforce. To wrap up, the basics of strategic workforce planning. How do we leverage what we have now? And what do we need to do to leverage what we will have in the future? both strategic workforce planning and analytics in general are in line or should be in line with the organization's strategy. And that's something we'll dive into in the next lesson. Second, when you're engaging in strategic workforce planning, and the same applies to HR analytics, use the 20-80 rule. 20% of the effort results in 80% of the result. Focus on the 20% of the workforce that brings in 80% of the money that has 80% of the impact on the business. So start with the organization's primary functions and leave overhead and management out of your primary analysis. They are of secondary concern. It's almost impossible to analyze all of your workforce because that's a lot of work to do. Start with the 20% that really matters to the bottom line performance of your organization. And third, workforce planning has a tactical or strategical character. It focuses on the long term. If I today make a decision about the competencies that I'm looking for and the people that I'm trying to hire, the people that I hire will stick with my organization for the next 5, 10, maybe 15, maybe even 20 years. So the decisions that I make today will impact the workforce on the absolute long term and will also impact the organizational strategy because the people that I have in my organization need to be able to execute the strategy of next year and the year after, etc. So on the one hand, strategy is leading in creating and determining which characteristics we are looking for in our workforce. But on the other hand, the characteristics that we have in our workforce will direct and will steer the organizational strategy, because as an organization you have a number of strengths that help you be good at what you're good at. And in your organizational strategy, you'll leverage those strengths to gain a competitive advantage.